I am Detective Miller Files, and this case takes me back to a winter morning in Wisconsin, a morning that still clings to my memory, like the frost on the barren fields of Plainfield. The sky was a dull sheet of gray, the kind that makes the entire world feel like it has been drained of color, leaving only the cold truth beneath. I remember pulling up along the dirt road leading to the old Gein property. My car tires rolled over gravel that cracked like bone under weight. Even before I stepped out, I felt something wrong in the air, a chill that was more than winter. It was the kind of chill that comes from a place holding something it shouldn't. But before we get to the horrors behind that door, before we talk about body parts stitched into furniture or faces turned into masks, we have to go back. Because no monster appears fully formed. They are grown. They are shaped. They are carved into existence by the hands that raise them and the world that neglects them. That is why Part 1 begins long before 1957, long before the arrest, long before the farmhouse became a crime scene. It begins in the quiet cradle of Plainfield itself, in a family whose silence spoke louder than screams. Plainfield was never a lively place. It was the kind of town where nothing happened, and when something finally did, it shattered the community so completely that decades later, people still whispered about it. The residents were hard-working, independent, and private. They valued minding their own business, a virtue that would later allow unimaginable horrors to grow unnoticed. This was where the Gein family lived, on a bleak stretch of farmland miles from the nearest neighbor. Even in a town known for isolation, the Gein property felt like a different world, a lonely island surrounded by hayfields, marshland, and endless prairie wind. Edward Theodore Gein was born on August 27, 1906. At first glance, he was just another farm boy. You wouldn't have looked twice at him, but the environment that shaped him was unlike what any child should endure. His father, George Gein, was a man worn down by failure, a former tanner who had drifted between jobs, unable to keep steady work because of alcoholism. He was quiet, passive, and beaten down by life and by his wife. His presence barely registered in the household, except for the occasional slurred frustration or the heavy footsteps of a man who had long abandoned any hope for change. For Ed, his father was a ghost long before he died. The real force in the house was Augusta. If Ed's father was a ghost, then Augusta was the iron fist that kept the entire world in place. She ruled the family with a fanatic's conviction, a stern, oppressive woman who believed humanity was tainted by sin and women outside of marriage were the tools of Satan. She looked at the world with hatred and disgust, and she passed that same view to her sons. Ed and his older brother Henry were constantly subjected to her sermons about damnation, impurity, and the wicked nature of mankind. Sermons that turned the outside world into something dangerous and filthy. Augusta didn't just tell her boys what was right. She told them what was wrong, in graphic, uncompromising detail. And Ed listened. Every single word went straight into him, carving deep grooves that never healed. Most children develop their sense of self by exploring the world around them. Ed never had that chance. Augusta isolated him, shielding him from friendships, from normal relationships, from female influence. She believed the only righteous path was obedience to her and to God as she understood him. Whenever Ed showed curiosity about people in town, especially women, Augusta condemned him harshly. She often read to her sons from the Bible's most violent chapters, painting the world as a battlefield between purity and temptation. Ed grew up believing that everything outside his mother's worldview was dangerous, corrupt, sinful, and he believed it with a devotion that would later twist into madness. Despite the strictness of the household, Ed always clung to Augusta like a desperate child. She was his anchor, his guide, the center of his small and trembling universe. Even when she belittled him or condemned him, he accepted every word as truth. The bond was toxic, yet unbreakable. For Ed, love and control were inseparable, and pain was simply part of devotion. When Ed went to school, he struggled, he was shy, withdrawn, socially awkward. His attempts to make friends were shut down by Augusta, who believed all other children were morally inferior. Schoolmates remembered him as strange, sometimes smiling to himself for no reason, sometimes laughing out of place. He was teased relentlessly, yet whenever teachers saw bruises on him or heard stories of Augusta's harsh discipline, they looked away. This was Plainfield. People didn't interfere. Everyone minded their own business, even when they shouldn't have. As he grew older, Ed developed a dark fascination with anatomy. It began innocently enough, reading medical books, anatomy diagrams, and even articles about autopsies. But the interest soon crossed into something else, something more obsessive, something Augusta would have never allowed had she known. Yet Ed kept it to himself, storing images of the human body in his mind like forbidden knowledge. The fascination festered in silence. The first major blow came in 1940, when Ed's father finally drank himself to death. Ed was 34. Henry was older and more grounded. Unlike Ed, he saw their mother for who she really was, controlling, manipulative, and dangerously influential. Henry tried to pull Ed away from Augusta's grasp. He warned him that their mother's teachings were toxic. This didn't sit well with Augusta, and Ed internalized the conflict as betrayal. In 1944, the Gein farm experienced a fire. According to Ed, he and Henry became separated while trying to extinguish it. Ed claimed he couldn't find his brother and sought help. But when Henry's body was found, it lay face down in an area that showed no signs of fire. His head bore bruises. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but many investigators, myself included, believe Henry may have been Ed's first victim. It was too convenient, too suspicious, too perfectly timed in the development of Ed's psyche. With Henry gone, Augusta's world returned to equilibrium. Ed was now alone with the only person he worshipped, but the equilibrium didn't last. Just months later, Augusta suffered a stroke. Ed cared for her obsessively, never leaving her side. When she finally died in December 1945, Ed's world collapsed. Losing his mother was like losing gravity. Everything that kept him grounded, however twisted that grounding was, disappeared. The grief didn't just break him, it dismantled him. Every boundary between right and wrong, between life and death, between real and imagined, began to dissolve. After Augusta's death, Ed shut off the rooms she used, preserving them like museum exhibits. He refused to touch anything in her quarters, her bedroom, the parlor, the sitting room, all sealed away. Meanwhile, the rest of the house fell into decay. Junk piled in corners. Dirt layered the floors. Newspapers stacked to the ceiling. It became a physical representation of Ed's mind, frozen in some places, rotting in others. This was the beginning of the transformation, the moment when Ed's childhood conditioning festered into obsession. Without Augusta to guide him, he tried to recreate her through books on taxidermy, through rituals he thought were holy, through fantasies about reviving the dead. He wandered cemeteries at night, reading obituaries to find women who resembled his mother, women he could dig up, take home, and use to build something he desperately needed, a vessel for Augusta, a shell of flesh he could step into and become the only person he ever loved. Plainfield didn't know any of this. They saw Ed as a strange but harmless man. A handyman who lived alone, smiled awkwardly, and told odd jokes. The town wrote him off as eccentric. No one imagined the storm brewing inside him. No one thought to ask what was happening on that lonely farm where no one visited. In a community where silence was a religion, Ed became invisible. And invisibility is the perfect place for a monster to grow. This is where part 1 ends. Just before the darkness spills over into murder, grave robbery, and the horrors that would shock the world. Before the masks, before the skin suit, before the police stepped through the doorway and found themselves in a nightmare. To understand the crimes, you must first understand the silence that raised them. And in Plainfield, silence was the loudest sound of all. I am Detective Miller Files, and as we move deeper into this case, the shadows around Plainfield grow darker. If Part 1 explored how Ed Gein was formed, Part 2 takes us into the nights where he transformed. Nights when the thin line between the living and the dead dissolved under the dim glow of a lantern. Nights that Plainfield slept through, unaware that one of their own was walking among the graves, choosing bodies the way other men choose tools. This is the part of the story where the silence becomes complicit. After Augusta died, something inside Ed cracked. It didn't happen overnight. It wasn't a scream or a break. It was a slow, suffocating collapse, like a building eaten away by termites, until finally it caves in on itself. With no mother to command his moral universe, Ed drifted. His loneliness became a type of hunger. His grief turned into obsession. He spent his days doing odd jobs around town, smiling in that nervous, childlike way that made people dismiss him as harmless. But at night, he went home to an empty house and an emptier mind. Ed had always been fascinated by anatomy. But after Augusta's death, fascination turned into fixation. He devoured books on corpses, taxidermy, funeral practices, cannibal tribes, and even Nazi experiments. Investigators later found hundreds of clippings and books about death, dissection, and the human body. This wasn't casual curiosity. It was preparation. Ed was studying the dead because the dead were the only ones who could no longer leave him. For a time, he tried to keep himself occupied by reading newspapers obsessively. He followed every obituary in Plainfield and the neighboring towns. He memorized names, ages, causes of death. He paid special attention to women who resembled Augusta in size and appearance. Women who had recently died, women he believed he could bring back in some form. Ed began constructing a fantasy, one where death wasn't an endpoint, but a doorway through which he could retrieve what he had lost. The fantasy crossed into reality one night when Ed found himself wandering toward the Plainfield Cemetery under a broken moon. The farmhouse was too silent, his grief too loud. As he approached the gates, he claimed later that he heard his mother's voice, calling him, telling him she was trapped, urging him to free her. Whether that voice was real or imagined, only Ed knew. But it guided him into the cemetery, shovel in hand. According to Ed, the first time he dug up a grave, he was in a trance. He said it felt as though his body moved on its own, as if Augusta herself was directing him. The ground was cold and stubborn. The earth resisted him. But the fantasy drove him forward. Hours later, he managed to reach the coffin, prying it open with trembling hands. He said he expected to see his mother inside. Instead, he found the corpse of a recently buried woman who matched his mother's frame. And something in that moment snapped for good. From that night on, the cemetery became Ed's hunting ground. He visited it under the cover of darkness, carrying lanterns, rope, pry bars, and shovels. Sometimes he dug alone. Sometimes he claimed he had accomplices, though investigators found no evidence of anyone else participating. It was possible Ed imagined the helpers, creating fictional companions for his gruesome work. But every verified grave robbery pointed back to him alone. He didn't always take whole bodies. Sometimes he removed specific parts. A head here, a torso there, skin, breasts, genitals, faces. He treated the cemetery like a macabre shop. He knew how to choose the freshest bodies. He preferred those who had been embalmed recently, as the skin stayed intact. Police reports later described it as surgical. Precise, disturbingly practiced. Inside the Gein farmhouse, these body parts became building materials. Ed used them the way a carpenter uses wood. He skinned faces and dried them into masks. He tanned human hide and stretched it over chairs. He carved bowls from skulls, polished them, arranged them neatly on shelves. He stitched together a vest made of female torso skin, complete with breasts, which he would wear around the house during his rituals. He kept vaginas preserved in a shoebox like trophies. He stuffed noses with paper to keep their shape. He mounted heads on walls, the way hunters mount deer. But what makes this part of the case so disturbing isn't the gore, it's the ritual behind it. Ed believed he could bring Augusta back. He believed that by assembling a suit of human skin, he could become her. He believed that by wearing the flesh of the dead, he could step into their bodies, their identities, their memories. This was his resurrection, his twisted attempt at rebirth. He would put on the skin suit at night, walking through the dimly lit house as though he was his mother. He sometimes danced in it, sometimes spoke to himself in her voice. In his mind, he wasn't desecrating the dead, he was honoring them. He was saving them, and above all, he was saving himself from the unbearable void of being motherless. Years later, when I read his confessions, the detail that troubled me the most wasn't the objects he created. It was the way he described them with pride, as if they were art, as if he thought someone would appreciate them, as if he believed Augusta would be proud. Meanwhile, Plainfield remained blind. You must understand the nature of this town to grasp how Ed hid in plain sight for so long. People chalked up his odd behavior to loneliness. They found it amusing that he laughed at his own jokes or stared a little too long at store clerks. Parents trusted him enough to let him babysit. Farmers invited him for meals. Churches welcomed him at Sunday service. No one suspected the smell coming from his property. No one questioned why he boarded up the windows. No one paid attention to his late-night wanderings. Silence was the culture. Privacy was sacred. That silence became a shield for Ed to commit the unimaginable. But even in the quietest towns, whispers still exist. Some people noticed Ed's increasingly erratic behavior. He spoke about dead women as if they were still alive. He told neighbors strange stories about missing people, as if testing their reactions. He mentioned visiting cemeteries at night, laughing it off as a joke. Some folks thought he was creepy. Others felt sorry for him, but no one confronted him. No one reported anything. After all, this was Plainfield. Who would believe the odd handyman was digging up bodies? Years passed like this, with Ed drifting between his public face and his private rituals. But every descent has a bottom, and Ed was about to fall deeper. There was a turning point investigators identified years later, something subtle but devastating. Ed began to believe the cemetery wasn't enough. His fantasies demanded fresher bodies, bodies that hadn't decomposed, bodies that still carried warmth, bodies he wouldn't have to dig for. This shift in desire marked the final stage of his transformation. The grave robber was becoming a killer. One event in particular reveals how unstable he had become. Ed had developed an obsession with a local tavern owner named Mary Hogan. She was bold, foul-mouthed, nothing like Augusta. But Ed saw something in her face that reminded him of his mother's shape. He fixated on her. Friends recalled him talking about Mary as if she were part of his household. Once, after Mary disappeared in 1954, Ed told neighbors she was at his place right now. They laughed, assuming he was joking. They didn't know Mary's severed head was literally in his house, stored in a paper bag. Ed's double life continued like that, slipping between reality and delusion until November 1957, when he took his first confirmed life, Bernice Worden. But that story belongs to Part 3. For now, Part 2 stays in the graveyards, in the dimly lit rooms of the Gein farmhouse, in the mind of a man who believed death was just another door. Ed didn't see himself as a monster. He saw himself as a son trying to resurrect his mother, a craftsman working with the only materials he had access to. The dead were not victims to him. They were tools. They were ingredients. They were steps in a ritual he believed would save him. As an investigator, reading these details years later, I didn't just see a man digging graves. I saw a town that refused to see him, a community whose silence allowed a nightmare to grow unchecked. Ed Gein was the product of isolation, a man whose madness required privacy, and Plainfield gave it to him willingly. This is the descent before the storm, the nights before the murders, the rituals before the bloodshed. Part 2 ends here, in the graveyard shadows, where Ed learned how to cross the boundary between the living and the dead. The next chapter, Part 3, will take us into the crimes that finally tore the silence of Plainfield apart. I am Detective Miller Files, and Part 3 takes us to the moment everything in Plainfield changed forever. Until November 16, 1957, the town was quiet in its familiar way: cold wind, empty streets, a handful of shops that closed early, and an unspoken trust among people who never imagined that evil could walk among them. Plainfield had always believed it was safe, but on that winter morning, the illusion shattered. It began with a disappearance, a single absence that felt out of place in a town where routines were sacred. Bernice Worden, the 58-year-old owner of Worden's hardware store, was known by everyone. A tough, no-nonsense woman who kept the shop running like clockwork. She opened early, closed late, and never left without securing every drawer and turning off every light. She was reliable to a fault, which was why, when her store sat dark and silent that morning, something felt wrong the moment anyone looked at it. Her son, Deputy Sheriff Frank Worden, was the first to feel the alarm. He arrived at the store expecting to see his mother behind the counter. Instead, the door was unlocked. The cash register was open, and the warmth of the room had been swallowed by a cold, unnatural stillness. Frank called out for his mother, his voice echoing across the empty aisles. No answer. When he stepped behind the counter, he saw the first sign: a pool of blood. Not large, but enough to say something terrible had happened. On the floor lay a receipt for antifreeze, handwritten with the last name, Gein, written across the top. Ed had been there, and he had been the last one to see Bernice alive. Frank Worden felt a fear that went beyond the instincts of a deputy. This was his mother, and the name on that receipt pointed back to a man everyone dismissed as harmless. A man who never raised his voice, never caused trouble, and always seemed childlike in his mannerisms. But scars of unease began to surface. Frank remembered Ed staring too long in the store, mentioning missing women with an odd tone, making strange comments that, in hindsight, should not have been ignored. The sheriff's department mobilized quickly. By mid-afternoon, officers were approaching the Gein property, And I can tell you from the accounts of the first responders, they expected something small. A struggle, a robbery gone wrong, maybe even a body hidden in a shed. They did not expect what they walked into. No one could. The Gein farmhouse stood like a fossil from another time, weathered boards, leaning porch windows that looked like hollow eyes. Snow had begun to fall, settling on the roof in a thin white layer, almost suggesting innocence. But the moment the officers stepped out of their vehicles, they smelled something odd, something metallic, something wrong. Deputy Schley, the first man to approach the side shed, carried only a flashlight. The door creaked open with a slow whine, and he swung the beam inward. What he saw made him stagger back so violently he nearly slipped on the ice. There, hanging from the rafters, was the body of Bernice Worden. She was gutted like a deer, dressed, split open from sternum to pelvis, her head removed, her hands bound, her blood drained, her body suspended by ropes hooked under her arms. The cold winter air had preserved her macabrely, giving her an almost waxen appearance. It was a scene so horrifying, so primitive, that it took Schley several seconds to understand that it was human. The shock spread through the officers like slow poison. Some ran outside to vomit, others froze in place. Sheriff Schley later said it was the single worst moment of his life, and he had seen war. But that was only the beginning. When backup arrived, they moved toward the main house, unsure of what they would find. They forced open the kitchen door, and the stench poured out like an invisible fog rot, mold, iron, and something else. Something dead, something else, something dead. Something old, something wrong in a way that infects the air. Inside, the house looked like a tomb built by someone who never understood the living. Trash, newspapers, and debris piled in every corner. Dishes crusted with years of grime. Furniture falling apart. But the filth wasn't the worst thing. It was the artifacts. The things scattered throughout the rooms that should never exist in any home. A lampshade made of human skin, thin and stretched. A chair upholstered in flesh. Bowls carved from skulls. A belt fashioned from stitched nipples. Masks made from dried faces hung on nails like grotesque trophies. A box filled with preserved female genitals. A human heart in a plastic bag, and then the piece de resistance, the woman suit. A full torso of skin, breasts, abdomen, shoulders stitched together with startling precision. It hung in a closet like a garment, waiting to be worn. Officers realized immediately that Bernice Worden was not the only victim. For years, Plainfield had whispered about missing women. Mary Hogan, a tavern owner who disappeared in 1954. Her head was found that night inside a paper bag in Ed's kitchen. More remains were scattered throughout the house, each belonging to someone who had a life, a family, a name. Ed was found not at home, but at a neighbor's house, eating dinner as though it was any other night. Officers arrested him without resistance. He smiled when they asked him where Bernice was. "She's at the house," he said, as if that were the most ordinary statement in the world. Interrogating Ed was like speaking to a child trapped in a man's body. He didn't understand the horror of what he had done. He spoke softly, calmly, even proudly. He explained that he had gone to the store for antifreeze, but something else had come over him. A feeling, a compulsion, he said. Bernice looked like his mother. He said he couldn't help it. He confessed not only to killing Bernice and Mary Hogan, but also to digging up graves. He described the nights at the cemetery with such detail, such fondness, that several officers had to leave the room. He talked about wearing the skin suit during full moons, about hearing his mother's voice, about trying to become her. He said it like it all made perfect sense. As investigators pieced together the story, a grim truth emerged. Ed Gein had been living in a private world, a world no one else entered, a world built from grief, delusion, and flesh. He had walked through Plainfield unnoticed, invisible, and the town, in its silence and complacency, had allowed him to thrive. What makes Part 3 so crucial is not just the discovery of Bernice Worden. It's the realization that her death revealed a decade of hidden horrors. That one body hanging in that shed was the key that unlocked the entire Gein nightmare. When officers sealed the property and called in state investigators, the news spread through Plainfield like wildfire. People locked their doors. They whispered. They cried. They refused to believe someone so quiet, so polite, so helpful could be capable of such monstrous acts. But monsters don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they sit next to you at the diner. Sometimes they fix your fence. Sometimes they buy antifreeze and exchange small talk as if nothing is wrong. Sometimes they are invisible until the moment they decide not to be. Ed Gein was one of those monsters. Part 3 ends with the farmhouse sealed, the evidence cataloged, and the world realizing it had just met the man who would inspire decades of cinematic horror. Psycho, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, The Silence of the Lambs, all of them trace their lineage back to the discoveries made that night. I Am Detective Miller Files, and Part 4 takes us into a place far darker than the farmhouse, far more disturbing than the shed where Bernice Worden hung. In this chapter, we enter the only crime scene more important than the Gein property itself, Ed Gein's mind. If the farmhouse showed us what he did, the interrogation showed us why. The first hours after his arrest were confusing even to the seasoned officers on duty. They expected resistance, rage, panic. But Ed didn't fight. He didn't hide. He didn't even seem nervous. He climbed into the patrol car as if he were taking a casual ride into town. His hands rested on his knees, relaxed. His eyes drifted toward the window, watching the snow fall with the fascination of a child, seeing it for the first time. What struck everyone was how harmless he looked, how small, how fragile. He was not a Leatherface, not a towering brute. He was not a Norman Bates, dapper and cold. He was simply Ed, a thin, stooped man with a soft voice and an unassuming face. The kind of man who could vanish in a crowd, the kind of man no one ever saw coming. But as I've learned throughout my career, evil doesn't have a consistent shape. Sometimes it looks exactly like the man you would never suspect. The interrogation room was warm, lit by a single bulb that buzzed overhead. Ed sat across from investigators with a half-smile on his face, as if he were enjoying the attention. The sheriff tried to maintain composure, but there was a tremble in his voice. He had seen Bernice, he had seen the house, and now he was staring at the man who had created it. When they asked Ed where he had been that day, he answered plainly. "I went to get antifreeze," he said. His tone suggested that this should explain everything. When they pressed him further, he admitted he had shot Bernice Worden. He said it as casually as if he were describing how to slaughter a hog. Then he added, "It was an accident. The gun went off." But Ed's definition of accident was not like ours. And the story he told next revealed something far worse. He said he remembered a feeling coming over him. Something powerful, something irresistible. He said Bernice reminded him of Augusta. Her face, her stance, the way she looked at him, Ed said it just happened. As if the murder was fate, not action. As if he were a puppet pulled by strings only he could see. When asked why he mutilated her body, Ed blinked, confused by the question. "I had work to do," he replied. "I needed parts. Parts. That was the word he used. Not remains, not body, not victim. Parts, as though he were repairing a broken machine. It became clear early on that Ed did not see people the way others do. To him, bodies were objects, skin was material, bones were supports, faces were masks. He did not perceive humanity as inherent. He saw it as something constructed, and therefore something he could reconstruct. The investigators pressed deeper. "What did you do with the other women?" Ed shrugged, as if being asked about chores. He described grave digging with astonishing calmness. Speaking of coffins, the way he might discuss opening a can of paint. He talked about Mary Hogan with a strange fondness. "She's at the house," he said again, completely serious, as if the discovery of her severed head in his kitchen were perfectly normal. The more Ed talked, the less he made sense. But in its incoherence lay a chilling truth. Ed's mind was not broken in half. It was broken into pieces. Psychiatrists soon entered the investigation, and their findings were unsettling. They diagnosed him with severe schizophrenia. They found symptoms of psychosis, personality fragmentation, possible sexual identity disturbances, and dissociation. Ed lived in a world where the boundaries between reality and fantasy had dissolved completely. He heard voices. He saw visions. He believed Augusta was speaking to him from beyond the grave. He believed he could bring her back by wearing the skin of others. One psychiatrist asked him why he chose certain women. Ed answered, "They were like Mother, not quite the same, but close enough, close enough." That phrase sent chills down the spines of everyone in the room. During one evaluation, Ed described the woman suit with a sense of pride. He said he made it so he could know what it was like to be her. He wanted to feel her presence. He wanted to become her. He believed that by wearing her shape, he could bring her soul back into the world. It was delusional necromancy. Ed even reenacted some of his rituals for the doctors, using gestures, miming movements of cutting, stitching, dancing under the moonlight. It was not an act, it was memory. Behind those dead, innocent eyes was a mind that had replaced reality with a nightmare it believed was holy. Meanwhile, the town of Plainfield was imploding. As news spread, people locked their doors, closed businesses early, whispered in fear. A place where neighbors once left their homes unlocked now felt cursed. Mothers held their children closer. Clergy preached about evil walking unseen. Reporters flooded the town, chasing every rumor, every detail. Plainfield became a name synonymous with horror. But there was another reaction as well: denial. People who had known Ed for decades refused to accept the truth. Some insisted he was framed. Others claimed he was too gentle to hurt a fly. They painted him as a tragic figure, a child trapped in a broken brain. Many blamed Augusta, calling her a tyrant who had created the monster. They weren't entirely wrong. Hollywood heard the story almost immediately. Writers, filmmakers, and journalists sensed the power of the narrative. This was not just a crime, it was mythology. The man who turned corpses into clothing, the son who tried to resurrect his mother, the quiet farmer who hid an empire of death behind a locked door. Before Ed was even tried, creative minds began sketching characters inspired by him. Norman Bates, born from Robert Bloch's imagination, was the first and most direct child of Ed Gein, a lonely boy dominated by his mother, living in isolation, dressing in her clothes, losing the boundaries between himself and her. Psycho was published in 1959, barely 2 years after the Gein arrest, but Ed himself remained unaware of his influence. He stayed within the hospital walls, drifting between lucidity and delusion. Sometimes he asked about the farm. Other times he asked for Augusta. Once he asked if Bernice was angry at him. The doctors didn't answer. During the psychiatric hearings, Ed behaved politely, even amiably. He joked, he smiled, he answered questions with an honesty that was more frightening than any lie. He showed no rage, no remorse. He was not a sadist. He was not a predator in the conventional sense. He was a man trying to solve a hole in his heart using the only tools he knew, flesh and fantasy. One specialist described him this way: Ed Gein is not a monster. He is a tragedy wearing a monster's mask. Another said, there is no coherent logic to his crimes except in Ed's internal world. And that was the key. The crimes made sense only inside Ed's mind. To the rest of us, they were madness. The court ruled Ed legally insane, unfit to stand trial. He was committed indefinitely to a state mental institution. He accepted the judgment without question. He asked only one thing: can I go home soon? Home. He meant the farmhouse. He meant Augusta's rooms. He meant the place where the dead outnumbered the living. Of course, he never returned. The property was eventually burned down by unknown arsonists. Some say it was the townspeople. Others say it was fate trying to erase a scar. All that remains of the Gein farm today is an empty field and a patch of earth where unimaginable things once happened. Part 4 ends here, with Ed confined to a room he could not escape and Plainfield trying to recover from a nightmare it could not explain. But the impact of Ed Gein was far from over. His crimes would echo for decades through literature, psychology, and cinema. And in the final chapter, Part 5, we explore how the legend grew, how Hollywood adopted his image, and how the world transformed Ed Gein into something larger, darker, and more enduring than the man himself ever was. I am Detective Miller Files, and this is the final chapter of the Gein case, the chapter not written in police reports or psychiatric evaluations, but in cultural memory. If the first 4 parts told the story of a man, this last part tells the story of what he became. Not just a killer, not just a grave robber, not just the creator of horrors stitched out of the dead. Ed Gein became something far more dangerous and far more enduring, a myth. The truth is, once the farmhouse burned and Ed was locked away, Plainfield should have recovered. The world should have moved on. But some crimes don't allow that. They leave scars too large, too grotesque. They echo. In the month following the arrest, Plainfield transformed from a quiet farm town into a symbol of American dread. People came from across the country wanting to see the property. Reporters camped outside the sheriff's office. Tour buses began showing up, their passengers hoping for a glimpse of the infamous shed where Bernice Worden had been found. It was grotesque tourism, but it was unstoppable. Anything associated with Ed tools, photos, even dirt from the property became morbid collectibles. The townspeople hated it. They didn't recognize their home anymore. Plainfield went from forgotten town to national headline, from a place of silence to a place whispered about in every diner, school classroom, and television broadcast in America. The name Ed Gein became synonymous with madness. But the legend was only beginning to take shape. Hollywood was the first to understand the dark potential of the story. Not the details, but the archetype. The meek, quiet outsider hiding an empire of death inside a farmhouse. The son so controlled by his mother that he tried to resurrect her. The broken boy who became a nightmare. It didn't matter that Ed had only killed 2 people. The psychological horror of his world was worth more than any body count. In 1959, just 2 years after the arrest, Robert Bloch published Psycho. The character Norman Bates was the fictional echo of Ed Gein, a shy young man dominated by his mother, a killer who preserved her corpse, heard her voice, and dressed in her clothing. The book became a sensation, but it was Alfred Hitchcock's film adaptation in 1960 that cemented the connection in American consciousness. Psycho changed cinema. It made people question the stranger behind the counter, the recluse living up the road, the quiet man who lived with his mother, and beneath that fear, the shadow of Ed Gein lingered. A decade later, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre was released. Leatherface, the villain of the film, wore a mask made of human skin and used body parts as household objects. Though the movie never explicitly mentioned Gein, everyone familiar with the case instantly recognized the inspiration. Ed's story had evolved from psychological horror to physical terror. Leatherface was the monstrous version of what Gein never physically became: big, violent, unstoppable. Hollywood had taken his quiet madness and amplified it into a chainsaw-wielding giant. But the roots were unmistakably Ed's. Then came The Silence of the Lambs in 1991. Buffalo Bill, a killer who wanted to sew together a woman's suit to transform himself, was a direct, unapologetic reflection of Gein's rituals: the skin suit, the transformation, the desire to become. It was not simply inspired by Ed, it was Ed, filtered through a more modern and cinematic lens. Gein became the blueprint, the origin point, the wellspring for every deranged character who followed. Not because of what he did, but because of why he did it. Hollywood didn't adopt Ed Gein's crimes. They adopted his psychology, his loneliness, his need, his delusions. Meanwhile, Ed lived quietly inside the mental institution. Doctors who saw him often described him as gentle, almost pleasant. He spent his days reading, doing chores, and making small talk with staff. He never caused trouble, never showed anger, never asked difficult questions. To visitors, he resembled a harmless grandfather more than the man whose crime shaped decades of horror fiction. When asked about his past, Ed's memories were fragmented. Sometimes he denied things. Sometimes he admitted them calmly. Sometimes he didn't remember at all. He aged into obscurity, his mind drifting further from the world. He never understood his influence, never watched the movies inspired by him, never grasped that his name had become synonymous with terror. The staff noticed that Ed rarely spoke about Augusta as he grew older. Perhaps age had softened the delusion, or perhaps he had simply become too tired to maintain the fantasy. He did, however, ask periodically about the farm. They always avoided the subject. The farm was gone, burned to ash, his past with it. Ed Gein died on July 26, 1984, at the age of 77. He passed from respiratory failure due to lung cancer. His funeral was quiet. A handful of relatives attended. No one cried. Reporters tried to photograph the service, but the cemetery staff blocked them. Plainfield had suffered enough humiliation. Ed was buried beside his family: George, Henry, Augusta. The very people who had shaped his life, his mind, and his madness. But even in death, the legend refused to end. Over the following decades, Ed's gravestone became a target for thieves and vandals. People chipped away pieces to keep as souvenirs. Some painted messages, others tried to dig. In 2000, the entire stone was stolen. Authorities found it months later in Seattle, thousands of miles away. Today, the grave remains unmarked. Just earth, just a patch of land with no name. Perhaps that is fitting. Monsters don't need headstones. As the years passed, criminologists, psychologists, filmmakers, and true crime enthusiasts continued to dissect his story, not because of the violence, but because Ed revealed something deeper about the human psyche. He showed us how isolation, trauma, and untreated mental illness could forge something terrifying, how a man could build a world no one else could see, how a community could ignore warning signs until it was too late. During my own review of the case, I spent days reading transcripts, analyzing reports, staring at photographs that should never have existed, the face masks, the lampshade, the skin suit. At one point, I had to close the file and step outside. The air was cold, the world quiet, and for a brief moment, I understood what frightened me most. It wasn't Ed Gein, it was the silence around him. The silence that allowed him to exist, the silence that let him hide in plain sight, the silence that kept neighbors from asking the questions that could have stopped everything. Because the truth is, Ed Gein was not created in a vacuum. He was shaped by isolation, by fear, by a mother who poisoned his worldview, and by a community that never intervened. He was not inevitable, he was preventable, and that is what makes his story so chilling. His legacy cannot be measured by the number of victims. It is measured by the impact he left on American culture, on horror, on psychology, on the collective imagination. Ed Gein became the face of a fear older than movies, older than crime itself, the fear that the quiet man next door might be hiding a nightmare behind closed doors. Hollywood immortalized him, but the truth was always darker than fiction. Norman Bates, Leatherface, Buffalo Bill, they were dramatizations. Ed was the real thing, small, soft-spoken, unnoticed. That was what made him terrifying. That is why his name endures. As I close this final chapter, I think about the snow-covered farmhouse, the dim shed, the interrogation room, the empty grave where his headstone once stood. And I realize that Ed's story never really ended. It lives on every time someone turns on a horror movie, every time a filmmaker imagines a killer shaped by loneliness, every time someone wonders in the back of their mind what hides behind the silence of their own town. I'm Miller Files, and the story of Ed Gein will follow me for the rest of my life, not because of the bodies he left behind, but because of the truth he revealed. Monsters aren't born, they are built, and sometimes we help build them without ever knowing it. This is the end of the case, but not the end of the legend.